Nearly 20,000 Buddhists are affiliated with temples and meditation centers in Texas. In the Austin area, there are at least 10 facilities devoted to Buddhist teaching and practice. Local bookstores feature dozens of titles reflecting Buddhist thought, including national bestsellers by the Dalai Lama himself, a world-revered spiritual teacher. Join us for a discussion of how Buddhism is growing in Central Texas on Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Bentley. Welcome to this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Recently, Texas Monthly magazine described the peaceful detachment of Buddhist philosophy as resonating more and more with those of us who feel stressed out these days. Buddhist practices are included in local hospital stress reduction programs, and meditation programs are regularly offered throughout Central Texas. What is Buddhism, and why has it been called possibly the fastest growing spiritual movement in the United States today? Today we have two guests with us who are active in the Austin Buddhist community. Flint Sparks is a practicing psychotherapist and a recently ordained priest who founded and serves the Austin Zen Center. Betty Holmes recently returned from a trip to Tibet where she continued her studies in Tibetan Buddhism. Betty is the owner of Tenzo, a center for Buddhist programs and retreats. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Let's begin by talking about how each one of you got involved in Buddhism. Flint, you've been a psychotherapist here in Austin for many years. You were raised in the Christian tradition. When did you begin studying Buddhism?
Well, I've had an interest throughout my academic studies in psychology because I was interested in the mind and also interested in how to work with people's suffering. And probably about 10 years ago, after being a psychotherapist for a number of years, I began to notice that there were ways in which people would approach the pain that they were having, coming to me with questions that were in some ways closer to how someone would approach their minister. They were things that in this culture would be called pain that had to do with their soul. It was beyond what psychotherapy could offer. I also worked for a number of years with people who were dying. And in that very intimate and very powerful time, there were things that I was learning as a psychotherapist about the questions that people had to address and answer and live with that seemed more spiritual, if it were. And so I was interested in that from a professional point of view, as well as, at the same time, reaching midlife. Those questions were important to me, and I had to answer them personally. And in my investigations, Buddhism, which has often been called the most psychological of religions, or even the most religious psychology, fit nicely with my interest in psychological transformation. So it was a natural.
Great. How about you, Betty? When did you first begin to study Buddhism?
I began to practice meditation and get interested in Buddhist philosophy about 7 years ago. Like Flint, I had grown up in with a Christian background. I was an Episcopalian, so I had spiritual values. I thought of myself as a good person, a kind person, and yet I noticed, like many people, that I could be swept away by emotions, anger, impatience, and that many times, although my intention was to respond in a loving manner, that I didn't have the space around an emotion or a thought to be able to respond in that way. And so I began to practice meditation, and I found that this gave me a tool for creating more space, that I could have my thoughts, I could have my feelings, I could be all that I am, and yet I could make choices that were kinder, more compassionate, more spiritual. So the two began to blend for me.
Your teacher, Lama Surya Das, has estimated that there are now 5 million practicing Buddhists in the United States. Is there something about contemporary American life that has made Buddhism more appealing in recent years? Either one of you.
Well, as I said, people are certainly coming to me with those kind of stresses and strains that all of us are familiar with here in Austin with all the changes. In the late 19th century, Arnold Toynbee was asked, what do you think the greatest significant event will be in the 20th century? And he predicted the introduction of Buddhism to the West. And that was over 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so as we enter the 21st century, we're certainly met a demand to respond to the stresses, like Betty's saying, with a little more space. We feel these time pressures and strains, and people want practices, not just beliefs, but they want
something
things
they can do
yeah. that helps them cultivate what they either see in someone else or they've heard from the Dalai Lama or some teacher that's very revered. How can I begin to develop that? So they look for practices, and Buddhism offers that.
I think, too, that people are beginning to see the limitations of our minds. We can accomplish great things when we have a clear intention, and yet people are achieving their goals and they're still asking, there's something more. What is the meaning of my life? Who am I? And being in charge with what psychotherapy and spirituality call our ego, it's very constraining. And to be able to let go and become part of something bigger, whether that is a community of practitioners or whether that is part of the natural flow of how things should be, to be more accepting and more allowing of things as they unfold instead of always needing to be in charge and in control. I think that's something we're all naturally seeking now. We're seeing the limits of our own power.
And it's somehow countercultural. The American culture is so much, I'm going to be in charge, I'm going to set my goals, I'm going to achieve.
I'm going to plan, I'm going to move into the future.
Yeah. And that offers us a lot. But like Betty said, then there's this, well, now what? When I get that.
Last spring I was in a stress management program at Seton Hospital, and they emphasized the practice of mindfulness. And I had read about that in terms of pain management and also in terms of spiritual development and meditation. I wonder, Flint, if you could tell us your own definition of mindfulness or what it is. It's so central to Buddhist teaching and practice, and perhaps give us an example of how it's been useful to you or one of the people you work with, or even with those who are terminally ill.
And Betty's already introduced a really important thing when she talked about a bit of space around things that seem very dense and real to us. Mindfulness is sometimes called bare attention or naked awareness. It's that ability to begin to let go of trying to see, or trying to hear, or trying to understand, and allowing oneself to just meet very intimately whatever is right there in the moment, whether that's an emotion or maybe another human being that's in distress. That kind of simple, sort of empty intimacy is a quality of mind that one can cultivate. For example, in working with someone, they may have a million thoughts and fears and questions going through their minds, and by presence, cultivating presence, if I'm with someone who has those fears, maybe they can begin to settle too. Mm-hmm. It's almost catching. Mm-hmm. That you can invite someone into that simplicity. Many people experience it in prayer all the time, but it's not a doingness. It's a sense of profound, simply being.
So trying to develop that way of being in the world, not just when you're sitting in meditation.
Absolutely.
Or not just in prayer.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. It's something, hopefully, that will begin to become part of how one operates in the world, so that we balance this heavy emphasis in our culture of doing with an essence of being and a presence that we sometimes miss in our busyness.
Can either of you give an example from your own story of when mindfulness began to affect your everyday living? Those are some of the most humorous stories I find when you read Buddhist teachers or you read about people's practice, those wake-up moments and when you're suddenly really present to what's going on.
I have just a small moment of being in a line trying to get out of the San Marcos outlet at Christmas and realizing that I was so angry at the car trying to cut in front of me, and just to stop and watch my reactions and make a different choice than I normally would of cutting them off and honking the horn. Just noticing my anger was something new for me instead of acting it out. It's just such a simple thing that over and over throughout the day you can see yourself making different choices when there's space just to watch, just to watch it come up, the feeling, the thought.
So mindfulness really begins with observing yourself,
Absolutely.
noticing, and just noticing, not judging, but letting yourself be aware. There I am doing that again.
It's amazing. We say just noticing, and yet it's such a powerful thing. We say just, but it makes an enormous difference. And for Betty to be able to watch herself and then not act out the anger, but also not act it in, not be mad at herself without the judgment, that's closer to mindfulness.
Right.
So things would probably move more slowly and more gently in our lives is one impression I have, as we're more mindful. We don't have that sort of speeded up, driven sense that is so much of American life.
And they're less serious. There's more space for humor. There's more space for giving ourselves a break and giving the other person a break. If you have the intention that you really want to treat every person with loving kindness, but you watch yourself when you're not feeling loving kindness towards the person cutting in line in traffic, you can laugh. You can say, oh, what a small issue this is. There's more space around it, more humor, less judgment.
So even if we're still moving fast, which we have to do sometime, there's a very different quality of movement.
Right.
Rather than the contracted, sort of harsh, dense feeling of hardness, there's a little more space, a little more breath, more, boy, am I busy, and this is really tough, and I've got to hurry.
A little more observation and maybe less self-involvement or being immersed in the situation.
And even if there is self, a little less judgment.
Yeah.
Because it's going to come up.
But that is an important point you just brought up, because so much of the time we are focused on our reaction, our thought, our feeling, and it's nice to put the attention outside.
Good. Well, we can come back to how that translates more fully. You're listening to Austin Faith Dialogue. Stay tuned as we continue our discussion about Buddhism in Central Texas. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue. We're talking with Flint Sparks and Betty Holmes about Buddhism in Central Texas. You both mentioned that you had grown up in Christian traditions. And there's such a lot of interaction now between not just Christians, but spiritual traditions of the West and of the East. One thing these various paths seem to have in common, though, is something we've started to talk about, which is the idea of compassion. I wonder if you could describe the Buddhist ideal of loving kindness and how this teaching, why this teaching is so central in the Buddhism of life.
Well, there's a context maybe we could start with. There are four aspirations that typically are taught together in Buddhism: compassion, loving kindness, joy, and equanimity. And these four kind of go together, and they're distinguished. So compassion and loving kindness are very closely tied. Loving kindness being sort of an unconditional friendliness of wanting the best for everyone, and compassion being that sense of seeing suffering and that automatic desire to respond to it. So one has to do with offering a kindness in a loving way, an unconditional gentleness and friendliness, and another a response to suffering and wanting to meet that suffering in some way.
And I think even more basic to the practice that I study is just the understanding that we all want and need the same things. We all want to be happy. We all want to be healthy. We all want to be free to pursue our lives. And when you know that and understand it, then you want to treat people with respect and equanimity. You want to treat them as you would want to be treated, the golden rule of Christianity.
And there is a Buddhist precept that's very much like the golden rule, isn't there? I mean, an expression of that?
Well, the precepts generally follow ethical guidelines like you'd see in any faith. And they have to do with non-harming, basically, and doing things that generally are considered good. And so they all, in a way, are different expressions of loving kindness and compassion.
Buddhism, in that sense, seems to me, just as I study a little bit and get to know it more about it, it seems to focus more on the practical, as you mentioned earlier in the show, things that people actually can do rather than ideals or, kind of values that you ought to hold and somehow mysteriously figure out how to embody them. Do you think that's a fair way to compare, or?
Absolutely, from my experience. I have a very strong grounding in spiritual values from my upbringing, but again, to have the tools when you don't feel like you want to treat the other person kindly, what do you do? And Buddhism actually gives me some tools. It gives me some practices to cultivate a certain openness of heart and a certain spirit with which I can treat myself and the other person at those times. And there are absolutely relative practices like Tonglen and mind training that help you with this.
I was in a discussion at the San Francisco Zen Center where I did most of my training once, and Robert Aiken Roshi, who is often the dean of Zen in the West, is in his 80s right now, was sitting next to me like Betty is right now, very quiet, in this discussion about faith in Buddhism. And after quite a long discussion, he very quietly raised his hand and just said, in Buddhism, there's nothing to believe and everything to discover. That it's something to do. And it's this process of discovery and opening rather than something to believe and then be set on. So it's a process, and the practices that Betty's talking about give us the tools. And they're tools that have been refined over 2,500 years, so they're not fads. They're not sort of a new age thing that might be kind of new and clever. They've withstood the test of time.
Can you tell us, Betty, a little bit about the Tibetan lineage in Buddhist teaching that you follow, and then perhaps we can talk a little bit about the various types of Buddhism.
Well, I practice a type of Buddhism called Dzogchen. It's a practice, and it has to do with the absolute view. And I think of it a great deal like a television camera, where if you can pull back and have a broad enough view, then you're not so self-focused, and you see the larger connections rather than the differences. And it involves two practices. One is cultivating compassion and loving kindness, and the other are the relative practices where you work with your thoughts and your emotions and transform them from the negative emotions into the more positive emotions. So there are two arms to it.
Even that transformation from negative to positive emotions is often talked of as skillful means. So it's even talked of as a practical thing you do. It's not just an emotional change, it's a skillful activity.
And it's also something you do have to practice, like the piano, because If you talk in terms of karma, and let's just think of this life, that we have habitual ways of doing things and grooves we get in, how do we get out of that groove? You have to practice, and if you're not practicing kindness, then what are you practicing and habituating? Something else. And so it's really a choice.
Well, I'll continue the metaphor you started with the movie. In working with one's mind to understand these things, you can be sitting in a movie theater in the dark, completely enraptured by what's on the screen, and you're feeling all the emotions, and you're really there. And then if someone next to you drops their Coke or a baby cries or something, you're suddenly startled out of your connection with what's on the screen, and you notice behind you there's this light, and it goes through the air, and it hits this flat surface, and all these images are dancing around, and really nothing real is happening. But you've gotten caught in it. Mm-hmm. Well, that's sort of like what happens in our mind. We create these scenarios, we follow them as if it's all really real, and in meditation sometimes we're able to back up. It's not that it isn't real, but there is an additional place we can cultivate to look at it and realize actually how we're making that drama, how we're making that joy. And in that process we have a lot more way to address our suffering, which is the central question that the Buddha asked in the very, very beginning. Mm-hmm. What is suffering and how do you respond to it? He said, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the relief of suffering. And that's the core around which all Buddhist teachings rest, is how do you deal with suffering.
And so that would be true of any school of Buddhism, no matter where it had originated.
Exactly.
Yes.
When the Buddha developed that in northern India about 2,500 years ago, it traveled into Tibet and combined with the shamanistic religions there, and over centuries became this amazing cultural expression of Buddhism in Tibetan Buddhism, and what's called the Vajrayana. It moved into China and integrated with Taoism, which existed there already, and became Zen, which moved into Korea and Japan. Moved into Southeast Asia, and the old way, the Theravadan tradition, the way of the elders, was maintained, more similar to the way it was in India. And those three threads still remain today.
Okay.
And that's what we're doing in America now. It's coming here, and you have a Baptist and Episcopalian who are learning meditation techniques and using it to support their spiritual values, and I believe it's really an important tool. And as Flint said, there's everything to discover and nothing to believe. Mm-hmm. It can blend with many other forms of meditation like prayer and Christian traditions and the Jewish tradition. There are many people who practice meditation from these different schools here in America.
And so a person who, for instance, may stay with their religious community, if it was Jewish or Christian, could also come and study to learn meditation.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
You don't have to become a Buddhist. Mm-hmm. That's in some ways irrelevant to the practices themselves. They're supportive and available. I tell my Christian family who ask me about this, so the thing that has brought me closer and deeper and back to my Christian roots the most has been my Buddhist study.
We have just a few minutes left, and I'd really like to have you tell us about Tenzo, a little bit more about Tenzo and about the Austin Zen Center. Should we start with, tell us a little bit about Tenzo, and I think on the screen we'll see how people can contact you.
Well, I've tried to create with Tenzo a place that expresses many of these Buddhist values, and a place where people can come and touch into meditation, be introduced to it. And I believe Tenzo was a real co-arising with Flint's practice in the Austin Zen Center. There was a close relationship. We both began our practices at the same time. So we bring in teachers from different traditions to teach, and we do weekend retreats. The Austin Zen Center does week-long sessions there, but we also do corporate retreats and private events there for people who want a sacred setting for these important times.
And you told me you have a teacher coming in August 29th?
We have two major teachers coming this fall. Lama Surya Das, my teacher, will be here. He's doing a private retreat, but he's giving a public lecture at the Dell campus on August 29th that evening. Okay. And then there's a Zen teacher, Reb Anderson, who is a quite wonderful teacher who's coming in October. He'll be doing a weekend retreat and a 5-day session.
Great. And what about the Austin Zen Center, Flint?
The Zen Center began really with people coming to sit with me in my office who wanted to meditate, knowing that I was doing training at the San Francisco Zen Center. That began to grow, and after a very few years, we decided we needed a place, and we got a small space at Clear Spring Studio, a yoga studio in the beginning, and then moved later on to a house, and were incorporated and became an independent center. We've been fortunate that the San Francisco Zen Center has supported us in sending a teacher, Reverend Barbara Cohn, who's our resident teacher now in Austin, who helps us and supports us. Then I continued my studies, spent some time at the monastery at Tassajara and some in Japan, and then was ordained as a priest this spring by Zenke Blanche Hartman, abbess at the San Francisco Zen Center, so that I could help serve the community here. We have daily meditations each morning and evening, and people can find out by giving us a call or checking the website.
Okay, and I think we have a, do we have a picture of your ordination? I thought we perhaps had one. Maybe not. We do? Oh, there it is. Great, wonderful. It's a beautiful photo. And
was at Tenzo.
And that was taken at Tenzo. And Tenzo is actually located...
It's outside of town. It's about a 30-minute drive from Austin, off of Highway 71 on a beautiful bluff overlooking the Pedernales River. So a very sacred setting.
Good.
Even the name of the ranch reflects our connection. The Tenzo is the name of the head of the kitchen, the cook, in a Zen Buddhist monastery. And Betty was always interested in feeding and supporting, and that name came
community.
up. And so it's a nice connection. It's a beautiful setting. People love just being there.
Well, I think you've really given us a window into the world of Buddhist teaching and practice, which is something that isn't so obvious in the public life of Austin, except perhaps when, you know, some of the monks come and do their drumming, or there is a very well-known teacher. I know you mentioned that the Dalai Lama was in San Francisco, and a mere 50,000 people went to hear him. And certainly the recognition of him, which has emerged in the last, 20 years or so, 10 or 20 years, is a very remarkable indication of the reverence which people of all spiritual paths accord to one another now. I'd like to thank you for joining us on Faith Dialogue. I especially appreciate it because Buddhism has been a great find for me as a minister and a person who is similarly trying to help people, and I think we've really learned a lot about that together. One thing I might just add is that you have left us with a wonderful idea of just discovering. If we only had the idea that we were open to discovering our life and that it was going to be a wonderful discovery, perhaps a little, daunting at times, but that we could be humorous and compassionate, that would be wonderful. Thank you also for joining us today on Austin Faith Dialogue as we've explored the growth of Buddhism here in Central Texas.